Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I hope you've all had a great week. If you are new here, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. So today we are in Canada and we're going to be talking about the Abbotsford killer. This killer basically terrorized the city of Abbotsford, British Columbia in the mid-90s. Not only did this person commit some absolutely brutal crimes, but he literally taunted the local police and the community for months. I think what made this whole situation even creepier was that this all started around Halloween time. In fact, the first publicized attack happened on Friday the 13th, October 1995. And side note, Friday the 13th only happens in October once every 5 to 11 years. We had one in 1995, which is the year that this case took place. And we actually have a Friday the 13th in October of this year, 2023. The city of Abbotsford was paralyzed with fear. People were literally packing up and moving because of this crazed killer that was on the loose. To this day, there are still some pretty big questions concerning the killer in this case. The biggest one being, was he a serial killer? We actually still don't have a solid answer to that question. But after combing through so much information on this man, I can tell you with 100% certainty that if he wasn't a serial killer, he would have been if he wouldn't have been caught. And I feel like this might be a lengthy video, so let's just go ahead and jump in. It was close to midnight on Friday the 13th, October 1995 in the city of Abbotsford, British Columbia. Two 16-year-old local girls, Misty Cockerell and Tanya Smith, were walking down a dark, deserted sidewalk on their way to a friend's house. The girls had been hanging out with some new friends all evening at a party in the nearby town of Surrey, and after that party was over, their new friends dropped the two girls off at Misty's house in Abbotsford, where they had planned to have a sleepover that night. Misty's mother and stepfather had went out for the evening, and by the time that Misty and Tanya were dropped off at Misty's house, her parents still weren't back. So like most teenagers, the girls thought that they should take advantage of this freedom. And even though Misty had a curfew, she and Tanya decided to walk 5 blocks to a friend's house where there was a birthday party happening. On their way, they were just, talking, and they were joking around about how it was Friday the 13th and they were outside alone in the dark, and how they really hoped that they didn't meet a crazed killer that night. And as they continued walking, they came to a hedgerow that separated the sidewalk from the mostly abandoned parking lot of a hospital, when suddenly a dark figure appeared from the hedges holding a baseball bat. Before they even had time to think, the man had rushed over and shoved the girls through the hedges and onto the hospital parking lot. And then he demanded that they take off all their clothes. The girls were absolutely terrified, and so Tanya immediately complies and she takes off her clothes. But Misty didn't. She was just completely frozen in fear. The man didn't seem to mind though, because he turned his entire focus to Tanya. He threw Tanya to the ground, dropped down on his knees, then he set down his baseball bat so he could unbutton his pants and begin assaulting Tanya. Misty's just watching this happen in horror as her best friend is being assaulted by this man, and she doesn't know what to do. She could have actually ran at this point. The man's attention was totally on Tanya, not her. But she didn't run. Instead, she grabbed the baseball bat and she hit the attacker as hard as she could across his shoulders. This was enough to knock him back, but unfortunately it wasn't enough to do any real damage. And now the man is just angry. He stands up and he deflects Misty's second swing, and then he grabs the bat from her. Misty immediately just starts apologizing and begging him not to hurt her, but nothing she said worked, and the man proceeded to beat her with the baseball bat. Misty counted 7 blows before she finally went unconscious. At around 5 a.m. the next morning, a badly beaten young girl came stumbling into a hospital in Abbotsford. The girl had a broken hand and arm, and she had severe damage to her skull. She was also extremely hypothermic, and she was basically just barely clinging on to life. The nurses and doctors started working on the girl immediately, and they learned that this was Misty Cockerell. Hospital staff could tell right away that Misty had been brutally attacked, and whoever had done this to her had meant to kill her. At first, the only information that they could really get from Misty in her current condition was that she and her friend Tanya had been attacked by a man with a baseball bat, but she couldn't tell them where the attack happened so that they could go and search for Tanya. But now they know that there is another victim, but they don't know who she is or how to find her. Nurses called police to tell them what was going on, and they set into immediate action. They also contacted Misty's mother to give her the unfortunate news that her daughter had been assaulted and she was currently in very critical condition. Misty's mother, Janet, had been waiting for her daughter to return home since she had last seen her that night before she left for the party in Surrey. And she had really started to get worried when Misty never returned. So as soon as Janet gets this phone call, she rushes to the hospital to be by her daughter's side. And things were very touch and go with Misty's condition. They really did not know if she was going to live. By this point, Misty wasn't making much sense when she was asked any questions about Tanya or the attack. She was constantly drifting in and out of consciousness, and she would say really off the wall things like the attacker was 7 feet tall and he was actually married to one of the nurses that worked at the hospital. And at one point she said that he worked at a chocolate factory. So obviously Misty couldn't provide much information in her current state. But Janet did tell the police that the Tanya that they were looking for was Tanya Smith, and she pointed her out in a yearbook. And with that, the investigation into Tanya's disappearance and the search for an attempted murderer and child abductor was officially underway. So just as this investigation is getting started in Abbotsford, a 911 call comes in at around 7:30 a.m. So just a couple of hours after Misty arrived at the hospital. The caller was a man who had been out fishing early that morning in the Vedder Canal in the town of Chilliwack, which is only about 13 miles east of Abbotsford. The man told the 911 operator that while he was out fishing early that morning, he had made a gruesome discovery. He found the nude, severely battered body of a young girl lying face down in about 6 inches of water and surrounded by brush. At this point, the Chilliwack police knew nothing about the missing girl from Abbotsford, so they began their own homicide investigation. But word of this dead body spread pretty quickly, and it didn't take long before Abbotsford police heard about it. And they did confirm that the dead body found in Chilliwack was in fact their missing person, Tanya Smith. Investigators from both Chilliwack and Abbotsford came out in droves to start processing the scene. A joint task force was put together between the two cities, but since the attack itself had actually occurred in Abbotsford, they took the lead in the investigation. And at the scene, they discovered that Tanya's clothes had been thrown into nearby trees and scattered all around. The way that this was done made it seem like the killer wanted Tanya to be found. They could also tell that Tanya's body had been dragged from the road and down into the water. An autopsy was performed on October 17th, and it was determined that Tanya had been sexually assaulted. Semen was found in her body, and it was collected for DNA analysis. They also found that Tanya's wounds looked very similar to Misty's wounds, so it was determined that the weapon used on Tanya had also been a baseball bat. She had broken bones in her arms, just like Misty, which told police that she had thrown her arms up to defend herself. She had been beaten very aggressively on her head. She had fractures all over her skull. But Tanya's cause of death was not blunt force trauma like everyone had anticipated. She actually died from drowning, meaning that Tanya was still alive when the killer dumped her into the Vedder Canal. Tanya could have been saved since the fishermen found her very early the next morning after the attack. But because the killer dumped her face down and Tanya was likely unconscious when she was left in just 6 inches of water, she had drowned. Police released a statement to the public about the murder of Tanya and the attempted murder of Misty, but they were very careful not to release all of the information they had. There were 2 big pieces of holdback information. The first piece of holdback information was where the initial site of the attack was located. This was kept out of the media for a couple of reasons, but the main reason was that the police actually didn't know where the attack had first taken place. They knew the general area was along Bevan Avenue. That's where the girls had been walking that night. But at this point, they didn't know that the girls had been shoved onto the hospital parking lot. Misty was still in critical condition and her brain was swelling from all the trauma she had sustained. She actually ended up needing life-saving surgery to relieve the pressure on her brain. So she was not a good source of information at this point. So the police still did not know where the attack had actually occurred. They basically just started searching all along Bevan Avenue just to see if they could find any evidence to tell them that this is where it had happened. And it wasn't until October 18th that a police officer discovered one of Misty's hoop earrings on the ground near the parking lot of the hospital. So it was determined that this was likely the site of the attack. And another very significant bit of information that was withheld from the public was that a bite mark had been found on Tanya's right breast during the autopsy. A swab of the bite mark was taken in hopes of finding some DNA still present, And miraculously, they did find some DNA, even though Tanya's body had been face down in the water for at least a few hours prior to being discovered. They were able to determine that the DNA from the semen and the saliva belonged to the same person. A tip line was set up, and police urged anyone with any information at all to call in and report it. After Misty's surgery, it really looked like she was going to pull through, which everyone was relieved about. However, this meant that Misty's life could be in danger. The killer was likely watching the news very closely for any updates on Misty's condition, hoping that she would die from her injuries. Once he hears that she's recovering, he will likely panic. Misty would be a huge liability for the killer, and he might try to find her and finish the job. So Misty was put under 24-hour protection. She had an officer guarding her day and night. Now, during her stay in the hospital, Misty hears that Tanya has been found, and she assumes that she had been found alive. Misty's mother, Janet, did not have the heart to tell her that Tanya hadn't survived. So Janet and the rest of the hospital staff and police just kind of went along with this. And so if Misty would receive any flowers or gifts, she would tell the nurses to send them down to her friend Tanya's room. For days, Misty went on thinking that her friend was going to make it, and they had both survived this awful experience together. She had no clue that Tanya was actually in the hospital morgue. And it wasn't until Janet was confident that Misty was getting better and would totally recover that she finally told her the truth about Tanya. And of course, Misty was absolutely devastated. But even though she was totally devastated, she started talking to police, now with a clearer memory of that night. Misty said that when she had regained consciousness around 4 a.m. a few hours after the attack, she remembered pulling herself up and walking along a chain link fence and into a garden, where she said she sat down and rested and likely lost consciousness again. She said she woke back up in the garden, and that's when she saw the emergency room sign illuminating in the dark. So she slowly and painfully made her way to the hospital, where she stumbled inside and hospital staff began working on her. Misty also worked with a forensic artist to flesh out a sketch of what the killer looked like. Police knew that her recollection could be a little off due to her injuries, but they were pretty desperate at this point, and they knew that they needed to try to get at least a rough idea of what this person looked like. This person was now a serious threat to the entire town. Misty described him as a white male, looked to be in his 30s, slim, lean face, and he had thinning, straggly hair and a drooping mustache. Police got the sketch and posted signs all around town and all over the news, hoping that someone might recognize this person and call in the tip line. And someone did call in, but not to report a tip. At around 11 o'clock a.m. the morning of October 18th, a call came into the tip line from a man claiming to be the person who had dropped Misty off at the hospital. But police knew at this point that Misty had walked herself from the crime scene to the hospital. The officer asked the man for his name and if he would mind coming in for questioning, but the man refused and he hung up. Initially, this call could have been chalked up to, someone in the community maybe playing a prank. Unfortunately, those things do happen, but police knew that they at least needed to look into this call. But this would actually be the first of many interactions the police would have with the killer in the coming months. This first phone call kicked off the killer's sadistic campaign of terror over the city and the police. So even though police thought that there was a chance that this was just a phony call, they did decide to go ahead and look into it. And they ended up tracing the call to a payphone at the Circle K gas station in Abbotsford. So they hopped into their patrol cars and they headed straight over to the Circle K, but of course once they got there, the man was long gone. They asked around to see if there were any witnesses, but no one had any valuable information. But it wasn't long before the killer would contact police for a second time. In fact, he called later the same day as he had placed that first call. And when the police officer answered the tip line, the man on the other end gave him the description of where the attack took place. And remember, this information was being withheld from the public. The police had actually just discovered the crime scene that morning, so there wouldn't have really been that much time for any information to leak somehow to the public. The caller said, quote, "I know where the murder happened, beside a walkway that runs north and south on a grassy knoll behind trees." The officer asked the man where he was getting this information, to which the man responded, quote, "I'm the killer. Her right nipple tasted pretty good." And then the line went dead. And now there was absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind that they had just spoken to the killer. He knew both pieces of holdback information, the location of the attack and the fact that Tanya had a bite mark on her right breast. The call was traced to another payphone, but this time it was across from the MSA hockey arena. This is in a pretty populated area of the city. It was a beautiful day that day, and there were people out walking all around the area of the payphone. So police were pretty hopeful that someone had seen something, and they spent over an hour interviewing people near the payphone, asking if they had seen anything or anyone suspicious. But again, somehow there were no witnesses. They even dusted for fingerprints on the phone receiver, which they knew was a long shot because tons of people touch those phone receivers, but they still thought that it was worth a shot. And then later that afternoon, another 911 call came in from the same man.
You think I would be stupid enough to leave fingerprints behind when I make a phone call?
The killer had obviously been there watching them the entire time. He could have even been someone that they had interviewed on the street that day, and they would have no way of knowing. And then just 30 minutes after that call, yet another 911 call comes in from the same man, but this one would really disturb police.
I'm the one. Just giving you the chance to try and find me. I'll be cruising around looking for someone else.
And now there is a direct threat being made to the public. The killer is letting them know that it was just a matter of time before he killed again. And when the public found out about the threats for more murders, they went into a panic. As I mentioned in the intro, people were literally packing up and moving away because they were so terrified.
I'm moving back to Alberta. I'm not going to wait around to be killed.
Something has to be done. They have to do something. Because we're losing our kids to these monsters. And he phones the police and he says he's going to do it again.
Once bustling areas of the city were now all but deserted. Taxi drivers started offering free rides home at night to anyone who needed it so they wouldn't have to walk the streets. Women were encouraged to travel in groups, and security guards started walking people out to their cars at night. Police and journalists have said that the fear that was ignited in the community was like nothing they had ever seen before. Tanya's funeral was finally held on October 21st, and she was buried at a local Mennonite cemetery. Her family had a headstone made that had a photo of Tanya and some sunflowers engraved, and on it the words, "Our sunflower forever in our hearts."
We will never hold her in our arms again on this earth, but we'll always hold her close in our hearts until we meet again.
Police did attend the funeral, and they took down the license plate numbers for all of the vehicles that were in the parking lot of the church. And they also recorded people as they were coming and going out of the church. This is pretty standard practice since killers will sometimes attend the funerals of their victims. And this video of the funeral does come back up later on in the case. After this, things sort of quieted down a little bit. They hadn't really heard much from the killer since that last phone call, but that would all change on Halloween night. Halloween 1995 has gone down in Abbotsford history as being one of the scariest they've ever experienced. The town of Abbotsford would usually have lots of kids running around from house to house trick-or-treating, but this Halloween was really quiet. By the time night fell, streets were deserted. No one wanted their kids out with a killer still on the loose. At around 9 p.m. that night, a 911 call came in, and the voice was very familiar. It was the killer, and he was threatening to find another victim and do unspeakable things to her. And he also again made mention of the bite mark on Tanya's right breast.
Just to let you know who I am, Tanya's right tasted really good.
And after listening and re-listening to the recording, the police believe that the killer was masturbating when he made this 911 call. And this constant mention of the bite mark on Tanya's breast was becoming the killer's calling card. He would mention it every time he spoke to police, and it was his way of letting them know that he was the real deal. The call was eventually traced to a payphone outside of a local pub called Gigi's Sports Bar. And police finally found a witness. A person at the sports bar saw a car, a beige sedan, sitting outside of the phone booth, and the car drove off right before the police had arrived. So this was at least some sort of a lead. And thankfully, despite the killer's threats, there were no reported attacks on Halloween night, which likely had something to do with the fact that the streets were deserted and the residents were on extremely high alert. Investigators eventually made the decision to release the audio from the phone calls to the public to kind of reignite the investigation. But they did edit out any mention of the bite mark. They needed this information to stay between themselves and the killer. They held a press conference where they would show the composite sketch that Misty had helped them come up with while they played the audio recordings. And police provided a 1-800 number for people to call if they wanted to give up any leads or tips, or if they wanted to listen to the recordings again. But what they didn't tell the public was that they flagged any person who called the 1-800 number more than 3 times. Once they called more than 3 times, the caller would be added to a person of interest list. With the ego the killer seemed to have and the pleasure he took from this entire case, it was thought that he would potentially call the number just so he could hear himself making threats and creeping people out. The release of the phone calls sent this case into national news. The entire country was talking about the person now dubbed the Abbotsford killer. One of the calls that police received was from a composite artist named Robert Exter. Robert had actually worked with the FBI when the Unabomber case had first kicked off, and he had been following the Abbotsford killer case since the news broke in the media. Robert told police that he had some concerns about the composite that police had been showing to the media. In his opinion, the balance to the face was off and likely was not accurate. He said that some of the features, more specifically the large forehead and the very wide set eyes, were not something typically seen in the average person. Robert ended up going to Abbotsford to create his own composite, and he worked with Misty to do this. And you can see that the proportions of the new composite do look more realistic. So on November 17th, the new drawing was released to the public, and on that same day, Misty and her family were placed in the witness protection program. The release of the new drawing did bring in a huge flood of new tips, but one name in particular was reported by 3 separate tipsters. A local man named George Evenden had been reported as being nearly identical to the new composite, and that wasn't all. George had a prior record and was suspected of trafficking drugs around the same location as the attacks had occurred. According to one of the tipsters, the day before the murder, George had been at a birthday party, and at this party there was a cake that had been made to look like a set of breasts, and George bit the nipple off of the cake, which I'll admit is a really weird coincidence. He also allegedly made comments that he would like to, quote, grab a couple of bitches off the street. And the most incriminating information was that George used a baseball bat in previous assaults. So before police had even heard about George, they had actually looked into some sexual assault cases that had happened in the area, just to see if maybe they could find a link between those cases and Tanya and Misty's case. And they ended up coming across 2 cases of assault that were currently still unsolved. So once police heard that George could be a potential suspect, they decided to put his photo in a lineup and show it to these 2 victims. And both of these women identified George as their attacker. But surprisingly, Misty did not pick George out of the lineup. He was still brought in for questioning though, and he very adamantly denied having anything to do with the murder. And when police requested a DNA swab, George, without hesitation, consented. They couldn't really hold George on Misty and Tanya's case, but since the other 2 assault victims had picked him out of a lineup, he was held at the jail. They also had a forensic odontologist come in to compare the bite mark on Tanya's breast to an impression of George's teeth, which again, he consented to without any hesitation. Police were cautiously hopeful that they had finally found the killer, but in the end, George was ruled out by both the odontologist and the DNA analyst. He was not a match. And even more surprisingly, when George's DNA was compared against the DNA from the other 2 assault cases, he wasn't a match there either. George was a free man, but there had been serious damage to his reputation. The public knew that he had been a prime suspect, and they really thought that he was the Abbotsford killer. And now the police and the community had to come to terms with the fact that the real killer was still out there. And this is when the killer broke his 14-week-long silence, and he once again made contact. Except this time he went way beyond just a phone call. On February 17th, 1996, a strange call came in the local radio station, Radio Max. The caller told the DJ to walk outside to the radio station parking lot and go check the Radio Max company car. At first, the DJ thought that the caller was giving him a heads up that maybe someone had backed into the Radio Max car and it had been damaged or something. So the DJ stops what he's doing and he walks outside to the parking lot and over to the Radio Max car. And right there on the hood of the car was Tanya Smith's headstone. And whoever put it there had written disturbing messages all over it. The messages included, "She was not the first, she won't be the last," "I'm still looking," "One day Misty," and "You won't find me." And remember how I mentioned earlier that Tanya's tombstone had a photo of her on it? Well, just in case people thought that anyone but the killer had done this, he also drew arrows pointing to Tanya's right breast with the words, yummy tit. And I can't even begin to imagine what Tanya's parents went through when they heard about this, and Misty and her family as well. The killer obviously hadn't forgotten about Misty, and now he's making open threats towards her. And somehow, again, no one saw anything. This man literally managed to dig up a 200-pound headstone and drive it to a radio station, unload it, which couldn't have been an easy task, and then put it on top of a car in a well-lit parking lot without being seen by anyone. How was he getting so lucky? No one could understand how this man was able to remain so elusive. The investigators ended up paying for an exact replica of Tanya's headstone, and they had a little ceremony and replaced it. And just 2 days after the headstone was stolen, another 911 call came in. This time, the killer was calling from a payphone at the Rotary Stadium near the running track, just 2 blocks away from the police station. And he just asked the operator if they had enjoyed the little gift that he left for them the other night.
How would you like my present I gave you guys? Huh?
I'm sorry, sir. I can't hear you, sir.
How would you like my present I gave you guys?
I'm sorry. I can't hear you. Okay, sir. Just a minute.
By the time the call was traced to the Rotary Stadium running track, the killer was gone. But there was a woman there who had been running on the stadium track, and she saw the man who had been using the payphone right before the police arrived. And she even saw the car he was driving, a beige sedan car just like the one that was seen at Gigi's Sports Bar. And she did get a decent look at the man, not enough to give a lot of detail, but enough to give a rough idea. She said he looked to be about 30 years old, he had reddish brown hair, and he was about 6 feet tall with a medium build. Robert Exter worked with the woman to create another composite sketch, and he also got a drawing of the car that the woman saw. And then just 2 days after that phone call, the killer did something really bizarre. At 10:30 p.m. the night of February 21st, the killer walked up to a house on a very dark street in Abbotsford where a mother and her children lived. He stood outside of the woman's house for a bit, then he threw a package strapped to a wrench through the living room window, completely shattering it. The woman and her children were totally freaked out, but they knew not to touch the package. But they could see some writing on the wrapping, and it read, "From the Abbey killer, call 911." So they did just that and called 911, and officers rushed over and took the package into evidence. And what they found would completely rock the entire investigation. Inside of the package, they found newspaper clippings of Tanya and Misty's photos, and the killer had written the words "lucky to be alive" on Misty's face. They also found clippings from 3 unsolved murders that occurred back in 1985. The newspaper clippings were from a 1989 Vancouver Sun article about the unsolved murders from back in 1985. Whoever did this had been holding on to those articles for like 6 years. And then they found a letter from the killer addressed to the police. The letter is kind of long, but there's a lot of information that the killer packed into it, so I feel like it's important for me to include most of it. Also, I'm going to put the words on the screen while I read it. Keep in mind that I have typed it exactly the way the killer wrote it, grammatical errors and all. Hello, it's me. Yes sirree, Tanya's right nipple sure did taste good. She wasn't a bad lay either. It was me that phoned from the Rotary that night. You cops getting a little pissed off yet? Hard to catch someone who's smart. Not like some stupid crooks that are no minds. Here are a few more of my conquests. I told you it wasn't my first, and it won't be my last either. I don't stay with the same MO. I have done more after these ones also. Go figure out which ones. Look in BC, Alta, and a few in Washington State. How come you guys haven't clued into some of the incidents here in town the last couple of years? Borkin by McDonald's, teen who was attempted sex assault. I grabbed her breast and was about to gag her when she took off on me. Oriole Drive, I almost had that woman beat senseless and was about to rape her when a car came along. I sure don't need to be seen. How about right across from the hospital? Hey, that was the same bat that was used on Misty and Tanya. As soon as I saw it was an Indian, I said no way, could have AIDS. So I took her backpack, found $200 in it, and threw it atop the old brick store. Hey guys, I'm bad. I will strike again one day. I will not be caught. I will not move from Abbotsford. Bye guys. This is the last time you hear from me. Till next time. So there is a lot to unpack in this letter. First of all, police now fully believe that Tanya and Misty had not been the killer's first victims. He had mentioned this to police in previous phone calls, but they didn't know if this was just for dramatic effect or if this was the truth. The Borkin case that he mentioned happened right outside of McDonald's actually involved a 12-year-old girl. The girl was just innocently sitting in front of the McDonald's when a man walked up behind her, groped her breast, and then attempted to pull her off to abduct her. But the girl fought back and she managed to get away, and the man quickly fled the scene. She didn't get a good look at the man's face, but she did say that his arms were covered in freckles and red hair, and also that he had an anchor tattoo on his forearm. The next victim that he mentioned was a woman who was attacked on Oriole Drive. This woman suffered with mental health issues, and she was actually living at an outpatient treatment center. One night she was just enjoying a walk when suddenly someone came up behind her and hit her over the head, causing her to lose consciousness. When she finally came to, she was being dragged off by her feet. But just then a car started coming down the street and the headlights freaked the attacker out and he took off. And then there's the woman who he said he beat with the same baseball bat as he had Tanya and Misty. This woman had been attacked just 2 months before the murder of Tanya. She had been out at a bar that night, but she had a fight with her boyfriend, so she just decided to leave. She started walking down the sidewalk and that's all she could remember. A passerby spotted her lying on the ground and took her to the hospital. And she was beaten so severely that a piece of her skull had penetrated her brain. She definitely would have died from her injuries if she hadn't been found when she was. Her purse was later found on the roof of a store and $225 was missing, just like the killer said in the letter. And the mention of the 3 unsolved murders from 1985 had made them wonder if they were actually dealing with a serial killer. This entire investigation had obviously become a game to the killer, and he was loving every minute of it. And he really didn't think he would ever be caught, but his reign of terror was about to end, and it would be his own ego that would be his downfall. So, like I said, investigators processed the package and the letter inside and out. They searched every inch of that thing for any evidence. And it paid off because they finally managed to find one single fingerprint, and not a partial print either, a full print. The fingerprint finding was huge because now they could compare the print to the ones in their database and they could finally have their man. But unfortunately, when they searched the Canadian database, there was no hit. So then they tried the American database. The killer had mentioned that he had committed some crimes in Washington state, so maybe he'd have a record in the US. But still nothing. Investigators couldn't believe that their killer had no prior record. The profilers had been certain that this person they were dealing with was a career criminal. So they decided to just compile all of this new information, including a drawing of the anchor tattoo that the 12-year-old victim had mentioned, and a drawing of the beige sedan that the woman at the track had seen. They just put all of this information onto a poster and they released it to the media. They also hired a professional to clean up the background noise from the audio recordings of the phone calls. And they also announced that there was now a $40,000 reward to anyone who gave any tips that led to the arrest of the killer. And just 3 hours after the release of this new information and audio, they got the call that they had been waiting for. A woman called the tip line claiming that she was positive that she recognized the voice of the killer. It was her own son, 31-year-old Terry Driver. She said that she and some of Terry's other family members had listened to the recordings on the playback line and they knew without a doubt that the voice belonged to Terry. She also said that Terry had a car that looked very similar to the one in the sketch. He also frequently fished at Vetter Canal, and he lived just a few blocks over from the Rotary Stadium where one of the 911 calls had been made. And Terry had been acting a little strange over the last few months. Not long after Tanya's murder, he and his brother had gotten into a fight, and Terry became very loud and aggressive, and he yelled at his brother, quote, "Don't fuck with me. You don't know me anymore, and you don't know what I'm capable of," which really creeped the family out. They didn't know what he meant by that. And then she told them that Terry had attended Tanya Smith's funeral. Terry didn't know Tanya at all, so what reason could he possibly have to go to her funeral? So this was a major red flag. But the only issue was that Terry's mom said he didn't look anything like the composite sketch. Despite this, though, police immediately go over to Terry's home to speak with him. And his mother was right. He really didn't look anything like the drawing. Terry had freckles and a mustache with a small beard, and his face wasn't nearly as thin as the sketch. And he had red hair that was slightly thinning, but not as much as Misty had described. And remember the red arm hair that the 12-year-old victim reported? So even though Terry looks very different from the composite sketch, police immediately recognize his voice. They had been listening to the killer's voice for months now, and it was burned into their brains, and they knew that this was it. Misty's recollection of what the killer looked like had most likely just been off, considering how severe her head injuries were and the fact that it was so dark outside. Also, it isn't unusual for an eyewitness to be way off on their memory of a suspect. Terry acted kind of nervous, but he didn't really show much emotion when he was being questioned, and he flat out refused to submit a DNA sample or his fingerprint. Up until now, every person the police interviewed was very eager to submit DNA and be ruled out as a suspect. So when Terry was so adamant about not submitting his DNA, the police were pretty suspicious. And then he ended the interview and told police that he would be getting a lawyer. So police left Terry's home, but they started digging more into his life. They learned that Terry was born on January 27th, 1965, and he was one of 4 children, and his father had been a Vancouver police officer. Terry had been born with brain damage, and he was eventually diagnosed with Tourette syndrome and ADHD, and he was said to be a very unruly child. He was eventually placed in a care home at the age of 5 because his parents couldn't handle him. During this time in the care home, it said that Terry started hurting both people and animals. I don't have any specific details on this, but it just seems like Terry was a very troubled and disturbed kid. While Terry was away at this care home, his parents divorced. And at the age of 11, Terry was taken out of the care home, or maybe he was kicked out. I don't really know. I just know that he left and he ended up living with his father. During his teens, Terry was bullied and teased relentlessly, mostly about his Tourette's and ADHD. So needless to say, he had a pretty difficult childhood. Around this time, Terry started frequently visiting sex workers. It got to a point where he was obsessed. He was working at a fast food restaurant at the time, and he would trade food from his job for sex. Once Terry turned 18, he enrolled in a trade school, and he eventually started his career in the printing business, and he got his own apartment. When Terry was 24, he became a supervisor for Scouts Canada, which of course is an organization that is centered around children, which is just really creepy to think about Terry being involved in something like that. In October 1988, at a Scouts Canada function, Terry met a woman who was 10 years his senior named Val. There was an instant attraction between Val and Terry, and by early 1989, the two had started dating. Val had always wanted a family, but she had never really had any real romantic relationships before, and she started to think that she would be alone forever. And now this guy walks into her life and he's showering her with compliments and affection, and she just got sort of swept up in the excitement of this new relationship. So when Terry proposed just 3 weeks after they started dating, Val said yes. And on July 7th, 1990, the two were married, and they bought a small town home in Abbotsford, and they settled into married life. But pretty much right after they got married, Terry totally changed. He became extremely controlling, and he would limit Val on how long she could talk to her friends and family, and he really didn't want her to leave the house unless it was for work. He also started spending money that they really didn't have, causing the family to spiral deeper and deeper into debt. They ended up having 2 kids, one in 1991 and another in 1992. And after the kids were born, things really started to go downhill. Terry became increasingly more volatile towards Val. Anything that she said or did that rubbed him the wrong way would lead to a huge fight, and Terry would sometimes become violent. The townhome that they had bought when they first got married now had holes all in the walls from Terry's outbursts. And there were times where Terry would put his hands on Val. Like I said, he was sending the family further and further into debt. And so Val was working 2 jobs, one of which was at a local bingo hall. She would work nights and weekends, and sometimes she didn't get home till like 2 a.m. And when she would get home, Terry would demand sex from her. And he was extremely domineering in the bedroom. He would be really aggressive and totally dominate her, which was something she was not comfortable with. But Val kind of got to that point where even when she didn't want to have sex with Terry, she would just give in and just let him do whatever he wanted to do to her because she knew that there would be consequences if she didn't. But despite all of these issues that they were having and the fact that their marriage was really kind of turning into a nightmare, Val wasn't ready to give up. She wanted to believe that the only man that she had ever loved would eventually snap out of it and return to her. In the summer of 1993, one of Terry and Val's neighbors called the police to report that Terry was standing in front of his living room window masturbating as a young girl was delivering papers in the neighborhood. Most people likely didn't know about this incident though, because the people in the community thought of Terry as a nice, hardworking family man. And even when this happened, Val didn't believe it. Terry just told Val that it wasn't him, that the neighbor just was mistaken and She believed it. But as bad as things were in their marriage, Val never would have guessed that her husband was spending nights stalking and attacking women. But she did wonder where he would disappear to sometimes. Terry started just kind of leaving at all hours of the day and night. Then he bought a police scanner and he started going out mostly at night, scanner chasing. And he would just drive all over town and he would listen to the scanner, and sometimes he would just show up at crime scenes. He had the scanner on pretty much all the time. He would even listen to it while he was at work. And on Friday the 13th, October 1995, the night that Tanya and Misty were attacked, Terry had told Val that he was going out scanner chasing, which was normal, but he never returned home that night, and that wasn't normal. When Terry didn't come home that night, Val was pretty worried. She didn't know where he was, but eventually she went to bed. And when she woke up the next morning, Terry had stripped off his clothes and put them in the washing machine and just crawled in bed next to her. And another weird thing happened about a week later. Val found out that Terry had attended Tanya Smith's funeral. She had been working the day of the funeral, and it wasn't until after the fact that Terry told Val that he had attended. And not only that, but he brought their 2 children to the funeral with him. And even though Val thought this was also strange, she never thought that he could be the killer, especially when she saw the composite sketch. The sketch didn't look anything like Terry, so she really just didn't think any more of it. But then on April 30th, 1996, Val's entire world would be turned upside down when police showed up questioning her husband about the murder. And by the time Terry finally obtained his attorney, his family and his boss had managed to convince him to at least provide his fingerprint to police so that they could rule him out. So Terry finally agreed to let them take fingerprints, but absolutely no DNA. And he also had a couple of conditions before he was willing to be printed. His attorney had to be present for both the printing and the comparison process. And once it was over, the prints had to be destroyed right away. The discovery of the fingerprint had been kept quiet from the media, which is probably why Terry had finally agreed. He thought that there was no way they had found any of his fingerprints anywhere. The police did agree to the terms and they took his prints, and within 20 minutes they confirmed that the prints were a match. And Terry Driver, the man who had murdered at least one person and hurt countless others and terrorized an entire community for months, was finally arrested. When the news broke that the Abbotsford killer had finally been caught, people were so relieved, but they were very shocked when they found out his identity. Like I said, Terry was very well liked by pretty much everyone he met. He just seemed like a typical father and husband. No one expected that he could be living a double life.
He was the last guy I'd ever think of doing something like this.
He just seemed like an everyday normal guy.
Terry's cell phone records were obtained along with attendance records from his job at the printing company, and also various items were taken from the home, including his vehicle. And by the way, his vehicle was pretty much a spot-on match to the witness descriptions. And the cell phone records were very telling. They could place Terry at the cemetery around the same time that the headstone had been dug up, and the Vetter Canal area on the morning of the murder. And according to Terry's work records, he was not working during the time the phone calls were made, so he would have had opportunity. So remember how I mentioned earlier that the 12-year-old victim saw an anchor tattoo on the forearm of her attacker? Well, it turns out that Misty had also reported a tattoo on the arm of her and Tanya's attacker, except she said it was a butterfly tattoo. And Terry didn't have any tattoos on his forearms. Police believe that Terry likely drew different tattoos on his arm, knowing that the victims would see it, and if they managed to escape, they would throw police off with their description. They really thought that since his father had been a Vancouver police officer, that these were things that Terry would have likely thought of. Police also looked at the footage that they had taken of people coming and going from Tanya's funeral that day, and sure enough, right there on the tape, they see Terry Driver walking out of the church, carrying one of his kids in his arm and holding the other one's hand. DNA swabs were eventually taken, and it was confirmed without a doubt that Terry was Tanya's killer. The trial began in September of 1996, and amazingly, even with all of this solid evidence that the prosecution had, Terry was still pleading not guilty. During the trial, Terry just sat there and he just had a blank look on his face, no emotion, no remorse, just blank. And when Misty was called to the stand, Terry just sat there, stared at her, and grinned. He really was just an absolutely despicable person. And Terry's defense was just as despicable. Terry actually took the stand to tell his version of events. He claimed that someone else had actually attacked Misty and Tanya that night and left them on the ground to die. He said he saw a man running from the area of the attack behind the hospital, and he went over and found the girls lying on the ground. And due to his mental illness and impulsive urges, when he saw Tanya's nude, unconscious body, he just couldn't resist having sex with her. And this would explain how his semen and saliva was found on her. He claimed that right after he assaulted Tanya, she died. So he loaded her into his car along with Misty, who was still unconscious. Then he dropped Misty off at the hospital and then drove to the Vetter Canal where he dumped Tanya's body. But no one was buying any of Terry's bullshit. It was pretty hard for him to explain why he had taunted police for months and also desecrated Tanya's grave if he really wasn't the killer. And on October 17th, 1996, Terry was convicted of the first-degree murder of Tanya Smith and the attempted murder of Misty Cockerell. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole until 25 years had been served. But Terry would never be released from prison because he actually died in 2021, the same year that he would have become eligible for parole. His wife, Val, really struggled with the realization that her husband was a sadistic monster. And all of these horrible things had been happening right under her nose for years. She fell into a very deep depression, and it got so bad that her children were actually placed in foster care for a while. But with the support of her family, she did manage to pull her life back together, and she seems to be doing much better. Misty is also doing well, and she has a family of her own, and she actually named her daughter after Tanya. And I know you're probably wondering about the 1985 murders that were mentioned in that letter to police. The only information that I could find was that one of the murders has been ruled out as being one of Terry's through DNA testing. But as far as I know, we still don't know about the other two. I don't know. I really wish that I had more information to offer you guys on those cases. But we do know that Terry was eventually convicted on 2 assault charges against 2 of the other victims that were mentioned earlier. So at least those women did get some justice. Please let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing to this channel and following me on Instagram at summer_SanchezYT. As always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.